they moved to the Ohio Valley because they heard that it was a good place to go. And when they got to Ohio, they met those damn Mormons. And they sucked them in. Sucked them right in. But Reynolds was a carpenter by trade. That's what his father was. He was a carpenter. So he was very involved in building the Kirtland Temple and the houses and stuff there in Kirtland. And it was a good time. They talked about Thursday raised money for the temple, and then the mobs moved in, and he talks about how he had to just shut the door and lock his door and walk away from this nice home he had. And they went to Missouri. And when they were in Missouri, they had a baby. And about that time, the prophet Joseph Smith was walking down the lane there, and he opened the door and invited him in and asked him if he would bless and name this son that was just born. It was actually their very last child. And he come in and he said, sure, and he lays his hands on his head and pronounces him Mahonri Moriankamer Cahoon. And Thurs is going, what the heck? I can't even say that, let alone how am I going to spell it? And he just named my kid this. And the prophet, he was all excited. And he said, that's the name of the brother of Jared. The Lord just revealed it to me. And so that was a pretty cool story, I thought. Yeah. Anyway, they got kicked out of Missouri, went to Nauvoo. Again, Reynolds was involved with building the temple. He was one of the main builders of the temple there. His wife, too. And while they were there, Brigham Young come to Nauvoo, and he was destitute. He didn't have a penny to his name. He didn't even have anything to eat. He was looking for work, and he was a carpenter also, so we went to Reynolds, and Reynolds says, well, I don't have anything to pay you. But he said, I sure got enough work for you. And Brigham Young writes in his diary that if it wasn't for Reynolds, he didn't know what he'd do, because anytime Reynolds got anything, he shared it with Brigham Young. And he said by the end of the year, Reynolds paid him in full what he owed him. So that was kind of a cool story. But I'll back up. Reynolds was baptized by Parley P. Pratt, not Parley P. Pratt. Say it louder.
Orson Pratt?
No. Oliver Calvary. Oliver Calvary. And he went on like 7 missions, and one of them he went with Hiram Smith on a mission, which is a cool story. But anyway, his sons were carpenters too. There was 7 of them, 7 children. William Farrington was his first son. But he talks in there, I read a story that the prophet Joseph Smith reprimanded him because of his kids. His kids were being rowdy. And so that way must be where Uncle Mark and Dad kind of got their That was kind of interesting that they were reprimanded because their children were staying in line. But they were pretty talented because there was like 4 of them, and they played in the brass band that was in Nauvoo. You know, the prophet had a big band they entertained. But anyway, going forward, the prophet Joseph Smith received a vision that he was going to be killed, and so he and Hiram one night got a boat, went across the Mississippi River. They were going to flee to the Rocky Mountains. They was waiting there. Somebody was supposed to come bring him some supplies to do it. But in the meantime, Emma Smith come to Reynolds and wanted him to take a note to the prophet. And she says, you need to do everything in your power to convince Joseph to come home and give himself up. And so he did. He went there and gave her the message and told him that Emma thought that he should come back. They just have a trial and everything would be okay. And the prophet said, Well, I must, I'll go, but it's like leading leading the lamb to the slaughter. And so he went back, and you know what happened? He was Reynolds, and then there was 10 of them. Reynolds was one of them, his bodyguards to the prophet. They were actually in Carthage there, and the prophet Joseph Smith sent Reynolds back to Nauvoo to get some paperwork that he thought that they might need for the trial. And Reynolds sent who was the bodyguard, the long-haired Porter Rockwell. He actually sent Porter Rockwell, and he stayed there. So it's just assumed that Reynolds was there when the prophet and them were martyred. And he actually, them and the rest of them that were his bodyguards actually got arrested after that, and they had to go on trial. But anyway, so Exodus, Nauvoo, they're going to Utah. Brigham Young sends Reynolds and his boys ahead of them to build forts and plant crops, and so they were some of the first ones to come into the Salt Lake Valley. And again, Reynolds spent his whole life there in Salt Lake building whatever. And when he got up in age, on 13th Street, he owned 2 lots. And so he was doing pretty well. Well, Brigham Young comes to him and says, Reynolds, he says, I really want to build a theater. And he says, your lots are the best place I can think of having them. He says, I really want those lots. And Reynolds says, well, I guess. Have at her. And he received a team of oxen and a wagon, and they paid some debt. So he figured like that he got like $1,000 for these 2 lots, and they were appraised at $100,000 at that time. So he goes to live with his son in Murray, and that's where he dies, basically broke, spent his whole life. Anyway, William Farrington was probably pretty old because he got baptized by Parley P. Pratt in Kirtland also. And there's an interesting story about him. It was printed in the New Era. It says, a home teacher to the prophet. Would you be a little nervous if you were called to be a home teacher to the prophet and his family? This is just what happened to William Cahoon, a young man who lived in Kirtland. He was, in fact, a bit anxious about his responsibility. I was called and ordained to act as a teacher to visit families of the saints, he said. I got along very well until I found out I was obligated to call and pay a visit to the prophet. Being young, I felt my weakness in visiting the prophet and his family capacity as a teacher. I almost felt like shrinking from duty. Finally, I went to his door and knocked, and in a minute the prophet came to the door. I stood there trembling and said to him, Brother Joseph, I have come to visit you in the capacity of a teacher. Is it convenient for you? He said, Brother William, come right in. I'm glad to see you. Sit down in that chair there, and I'll go and call my family in. They soon come in and took seats. He then said, Brother William, I submit myself and my family in your hands, and then took his seat. Now, Brother William, said he, ask all the questions you feel like. By this time, all my fears and trembling had ceased, and I said, Brother Joseph, are you trying to live your religion? He answered yes. He said, do you pray with your family? He said yes. Do you teach your family the principles of the gospel? He replied, yes, I'm trying to. He says, do you ask a blessing on your food? The prophet answered, yes. Are you trying to live in peace and harmony with all your family? And he said he was. He then turned to Sister Emma, his wife, and said, Sister Emma, are you trying to live your religion? Do you teach your children to obey their parents? And do you teach them to pray? To all these questions, she answered, yes, I'm trying to do so. I then turned to Joseph and said, I'm now through with my questions as a teacher, and now if you have any instructions to give, I shall be happy to receive them. He said, God bless you, Brother William. If you are humble and faithful, you shall have power to settle all difficulties that may come your way as the capacity of a teacher. I then left my parting blessing upon him and his family as a teacher, and took my departure. That's kind of cool. Anyway, William Farrington, well, he went with his dad. There's a book out that says Reynolds, Cahoon, and his stalwart sons. They were all there. William Farrington spent his whole life as the city works department in Salt Lake, building and whatever else. But he was married to Nancy Gibbs. They had 12 children. Henry Reynolds Cahoon was like ninth in that list, I think. And then he was a polygamist, so he had another wife, Mary Dougal, and they had 4 children. And if you look up where they are, most of these children from these 4 are in Canada. So the story is when they abolished polygamy, William just kept Nancy with him, and then Mary left, and then she must have went to Canada or something. I didn't really follow up on it, but anyway. So down to Henry Reynolds Cahoon. He was like the 9th, and when he was about 17, he went to Connor Springs, Utah. That's kind of southeast of Tremonton, over kind of by the mountain there somewhere. I looked it up on Google Maps. Anyway, he went there to visit his sister. What was her name? Lorona, who was married to Myron Bushell Durfee. Okay. So Henry's sister was married to Myron Durfee. And while he was there, he seen this cute little long-haired girl, kind of caught his eye. Well, she happens to be the daughter of Henry Dennison Durfee. She's visiting the family. And so they, over the next 3 years, didn't really say, they just figured that maybe he courted her, and they got married when she turned, Annie was only 14, and they got married when she was 17, they got married. And they spent a couple of years there in Connor Springs. And it said, that was in about 1876, 1877. At that time they had two twin babies that died. Not much record of it, but when they went to the temple, they had them sealed to them. It talks about Henry probably first heard of the Alamo Valley in southern Idaho from his father-in-law, Henry Dennison Durfee, who had been there in 1979 to stake out at Homestead. And it said it's possibly the spring of 1881 that Henry and Annie made their first trip to Alamo. It says they got down here to the Narrows, and they camped for the night, and some Indians come by and had war hoops and stuff, went across the ridge there, and they packed up camp, went back to Utah. Having none of that. Well, they got braver, so the next spring they come back. And he had laid stake to a claim of 160 acres, which is up around where Kurt lives right now. And then it said there was 80 acres of desert land too, so he had 240 acres. The desert land, I don't know. I kind of guessed maybe it was the piece just east of the road that Kurt has down here. Could have been it, that I don't know. But anyway, they started to make their life in Alamo. And Henry was very involved in the selling of the community. He was one of the guys that helped. You know, he was a carpenter, so he's building. And it says he also made most of the caskets of the people died that was buried in Sunny Cedar Rest. But it's kind of interesting. I was reading an article that Alamo and a lot of these towns were settled by Scandinavian people. And in Scotland, they built their towns around the castle. And then during the day, everybody went out in the fields to work. And they come back, because there was safety in there. And so Almo and Oakley and a lot of these are kind of laid out the same way, and they figure it's because of this. You know, Bill, Dad lives in Almo, and they go out wherever, take care of their cattle. Just a tidbit. So anyway, Henry and Annie had 9 children. The first one was William, and he was a pretty prominent member of the community. He was a deputy sheriff, served on the canal company. And then, like the third son was Henry Reynolds Jr. And that's where Arlie Cahoon's family comes from. It's from Henry Reynolds Jr. And then Annie, or Mary Ann, my grandma, was the youngest. And she had a sister 2 years older named Harriet, and they were pretty tight. But when she was like 14, I think, somewhere in there, they were at school, and they were playing chase, and Harriet come running around the building, and a big guy come running around the other way, and they hit head on and knocked her out. They took her home, and she seemed to be doing pretty well, but she died the next day. That was kind of a devastating deal there. So anyway, Ivan Leo, he's been hanging around. He's been eyeballing this Mary Ann Cahoon. She's the stuff. So anyway, he finally convinced her to get married, so they get married, and they living up there by Henry and Annie. Henry died when he was 57. He was pretty young, but he was sick for quite a few years. They talked about how he's a beekeeper. He planted an orchard. Pretty talented guy. And they talked about Annie. I read her life history. Talked about how sweet she was, but there were still Indians in the area when they first got here. And so she'd feed the Indians and make friends with them. And so when the Indians got rounded up, took to Fort Hall to the reservation, they'd still come back up the fall and get pine nuts and stuff, and they'd camp on their ground there. And Annie would feed them, and then they'd trade deer hides to them for gloves and stuff. That was kind of an interesting story. So anyway, back to Ivan and Mary Ann. They talked, I read Grandma's life history, and it was tough back then. She, besides being the mother to Joe and Mark. Anyway, she talked about she had to make 8 loaves of bread every other day. And plus, Monday was wash day. She went to her mother's on wash day because Annie had a gas-powered washing machine. And then Tuesday was ironing day, and Wednesday was darning day. The kids didn't have a lot, but they always had clean, mended clothes. She always prided herself on that. And she never did learn to drive. And she was in the Relief Society president, she was primary president, and she'd walk from there to the church when somebody didn't give her a ride. And they talked about the first 15 years when they were married. In the spring, they'd load everything out of the cabin into their wagon and go move to Grape Creek, because Grandpa had a piece of ground down there, and he put up some hay and had some cattle fed there. And then in the fall, they'd move back up here, and they did that for the first 15 years they was married. But they'd milk cows, and then Grandpa worked a bunch of odd jobs just trying to make things work. But Dad tells the story of when Grandpa had shot a buck out of season. And so the next day for lunch, Grandma packed his lunch, and she says, "Now, Joe, you tell everybody at school that that's mutton, if they ask." So Joe, he gets to school, and he says, "I've got a mutton sandwich because Grandpa killed a buck yesterday."
So honest.
But anyway, she died. I was like 6 years old. I remember Grandma just a little bit. not much. I do remember the funeral. I do remember going up there and staying. And my mom lived with her when her dad was first married. They lived with her for about a year. And when I was like 1, they moved. That's when they moved down to View. But she taught Mom how to cook and stuff. Mom just loved her. Good call. Bonnie, you probably got memories of Grandma.
Betty.
Betty. What did I just call you?
Bonnie.
Bonnie. I haven't even seen Bonnie for a long time. I don't want to call you Bonnie.
I do remember Grandma. I remember her kneeling at the bed praying every night. That's one thing I always remember. And Grandpa had a Santa Claus suit underneath the bed, and that scared me. So when I'd stay with them, I'd go to bed and then I'd be crying and Grandma'd come sleep with me. So I spent quite a bit of time at in Grandpa's house because we stayed there and had piano lessons with Mrs. King.
Yeah, she was big into temple work too. I mean, they were going to the temple. They went out to stay at Dolores, and they were going to the temple the next morning to do some temple work. She wanted all the family sealed to her, and she wasn't feeling good, and Grandpa turned around and come home. Before they got home, Grandma died in his arms next to him. But Dad was never sealed to Grandma and Grandpa because he'd been out in the way of the world by the time they got sealed. And so I got the opportunity to go when Dad passed away and got sealed. I stood proxy, and that was pretty cool deal. So, any questions?
Do you know there was a Brennan and Cahoon construction up in Pocatello? They were huge. Do you know anything? And I know that Cahoon was from here. Do you know which one that was?
I don't. There was 9 children.
What was his first name?
Well, I don't know. I thought it was Reynolds, but
No, it was Roscoe.
oh, Roscoe, that's right.
Roscoe, when he used to come back here and hunt when he lived in Pocatello.
Let me tell you about that business. I remember when I was a little kid, going where you go out to get on the interstate going north and south. You could look down in there, and there was a huge building, and it said Brennan and Cahoon Construction. And
Yeah.
Charlie Johnson, that lived down to Burley next to us, worked for him. He was one of their foremen. And I can tell you a story about what he told me. They built the high school, I think, up at Ashton, and completely forgot lath and plaster. And Charlie was the superintendent, and he said that he hired common labor, which was against the law, but he got that plaster and plastering done, and the job broke even.
I gotta go back here a little bit. Ivan and Mary Ann. Okay, so Ivan, Grandpa was Myron. He was married to Cahoon. Mary Ann was a Cahoon. So, family tree didn't fork there. Those people in Kentucky, we don't have much over, they don't have much over on us, except most of us have our teeth.
And they called Mary Ann named it, well, I knew about it.
Yeah, Nanny.
I've got a lot of cousins there with her.
But anyway, fast forward to a couple of years ago, Steve Durfee, he's eyeballing this little redheaded gal from Malmo. So he keeps up the family tradition and he marries his cousin. I didn't know a lot about the Cahoons. I knew some parts and stories, so it's been kind of fun to study up with them. And the family search deal is loaded with information. I spent nights just reading stuff, but I do need to have somebody to show me up because Annie Durfee's life history is not on there. And I do have a copy of that, so it needs to be downloaded to that because it's pretty cool, all that stuff that's on there, so. Oh,
My grandma Ida was Annie's younger sister.
oh really? Pretty small world.
And
Talk about anybody else.
Lorenzo. What's your brother?
Yeah, my grandpa Lorenzo was her brother.
Yeah, we're all, like I say, we're pretty fortunate we all got our teeth. Okay.
I have another question. This little house that's up under the trees right up here, this little cabin, is that a Cahoon cabin?
Yeah, that's where Steve Cahoon lived, which was Mary Ann's brother. Annie did end up living quite a while with Steve after Henry had died. And then she did end up marrying Henry's brother, and they moved to Boise for a few years. Then she got sick and she moved home and stayed with Steve for a while. And then she had a daughter down in Raft River that she stayed with when she passed away. But yeah, that's probably the picture that she posted of Henry Reynolds Cahoon house. But they said when he got there, Grandpa Durfee said that Henry Reynolds' farmhouse and barn and stuff were neat and tidy. He really kept things nice. But when he first come, the first house he built had a dirt floor and a dirt roof. And Annie had to get up every day and wet down the roof so it'd keep growing, so it'd keep keep the water from running off. So okay.
I've read their history, and there's something about the house on the clay hill.
I didn't
Does
read
that ring a
that.
bell?
I didn't read that.
I think it's in Ivan's history. Do you know, Janice, have you heard about that? And then when it rained, it got just awfully nasty. So I wonder if that's where the original house was, and where was the...
Might have been, because they kind of moved it at one time, that house where Lauren lives now. There was a piece there and they moved another house into it and kind of made two in one. But Grandpa ended up buying Henry's place from there. And so,
What do you know about your grandfather, Ivan?
what do I know about Grandpa?
Uncle Leo, yeah.
Uncle Leo.
He was a character.
Is that
He
where you
was-
get it from?
Well, probably. We used to love it when he'd come to Burley and he'd spend the night with us. And he'd sit on the couch and we'd just, on the floor around him, he'd tell us stories and sing songs to us and stuff. And then we always come to see him. He always had a jar of ginger snap cookies down in the drawer right when he come in. So he'd always give us a ginger snap cookie. And then he had those,
Black stick licorice.
well, I remember the little pink peanut-looking candies, and he always had them on the dash of his truck, and orange slices. But I will tell you one story. We had a piece of ground over there by Doug's, and we kept our cows up here. And so when at branding time, we'd brand Grandpa's and then we'd brand ours. And we'd come from the house, and me and my buddy, we were riding with Grandpa. We stopped at the store, and he always had a bottle of Clorox jug full of water. That's what you drank. It tastes like Clorox, but when you were thirsty, you drank that water. But anyway, we left the store and we pulled out down the road, and you know, Grandpa, he wasn't in a hurry. He was just putting along. This guy come up behind him in a pickup, was honking the horn. Grandpa, he didn't even act like he knew it. He just pulls over in the middle of the road and goes a little slower. And this guy, he tries to pass him on this side, and Grandpa, he cuts him off. Going slow. The guy, tries to go the other way, and Grandpa, by this time he's got a grin just as big as he can be. He's trying to cut him off this way. And pretty soon that guy, he goes clearing the borrow pit, and he's bouncing down there, going around. He's flipping us off as he went down there. And Grandpa was just a tee, and he said, "You must be in a hurry, huh?" But he had a dog. He had a collie dog, and that was the dangest dog. They had a ton truck, and he'd load that dog. He'd ton truck, they'd fill out with cows, and he'd jump that dog in the back, and that dog would ride in the back there with those cows, and those cows would stay away from him wherever they went. And then he got to riding on top of the cab of the truck. And then when Grandpa got a car, that dog would ride on top of the car, and they'd go to Burley or wherever else. That collie dog would go with him. And he had his horse, and we'd go down there and we'd get done branding. And Grandpa'd just take the saddle and bridle off, turn that horse loose, and we'd come up there to the ranch and doing stuff. Pretty soon that horse would come jogging down the lane and come home. Yeah, he was a character. He was a lot of fun.
He used to be quite a character, Leo. Nowadays we talk about multitasking. He said, "I can do 3 things at the same time. I can whistle and pee and drive the milk cows."
Annalie, what did you remember about him?
Well, I just remember Nanny, I'd take her places because, she never drove any. And I spent time up there helping her, and it seemed like she always had some lambs in the house that we had to feed on the bottle. I can remember that, and she was a very sweet person, yeah. She'd do anything for you, and she was just, they're ready to help.
Mom's mom was a school teacher, and she never taught her to cook or sew or anything. Grandma Durfee taught my mom all that stuff. Yeah, she liked curly hair. She said that she never had she didn't have a favorite child except for Mark, because Mark was born after one of the kids died. And he had curly hair, and she used to like to play with the curls in his hair, so he always had long hair and didn't get it cut because Grandma liked his long curly hair.
Aunt Beth will say, yeah, that Mark was the favorite. She
Yeah.
always babied him.
Yeah. Dad tells a story of Mark was about 4 years older than Dad was, and Dad had milked the cows, and he was packing the milk back to the house, and Mark was on this colt, and he was trying to teach him to cow cut, and so he was cutting Dad off when he was going to the barn, and he was bumping him, and he was spilling the milk, and the milk was all gone. And Dad was mad because he was going to get his butt kicked when he got to the house because he didn't have any milk, so he just hucked that bucket at Mark, and that horse jumped and kicked, and that bell of that bucket went and stuck right on the hock of that horse. And so he went to buck, and the buck barked off, and He said, I got my ass kicked twice. He said, Mark kicked my butt, and then when I got to the house with old milk, he said, I got kicked again. He said, it was worth it watching Mark get bucked off. Okay, I've said enough.
Well, thanks so much, Steve. We really enjoyed that. That was really good memories and fun to learn about the Cahoon family.
Dan, can I take a minute and explain the Durfees a little bit? Okay, I'm going to show you how we're all related here.
I don't know if you can explain.
So, yeah, I'm not a school teacher. So, Francilla Durfee is the ancestor, the common ancestor that we have. His wife is Marion Jones, or Marion Jones. They were from Vermont, and then they joined the church, and they ended up in Nauvoo. And when the church, when the saints were expelled from Nauvoo, she had just had a baby recently, and the mob put her out of the house, and she got sick from the exposure and died. And they had, I think, 5 kids. And so they were trying to survive after that. They left Nauvoo with the Camp of Israel, which were the first ones to leave Nauvoo. And when they started recruiting the Mormon battalion, he joined the Mormon battalion, and he was part of the Sikh battalion anyway, his family had also joined the church. Several members of his family had joined the church, and so he probably left his kids in the care of his sisters, and then he took a nephew with him. Jarvis Johnson went with him. He was 16, and so he watched out over that nephew. I think it was a nephew, and then back west they kept care of the kids there. So they eventually ended up in Providence. There were first settlers up in Providence. He was a member. Originally they settled in Ogden, and then they went with the Salmon River Mission, which is really an interesting story we'll need to tell. They were missionaries up Limhi area. And anyway, it was really a dramatic story. The Indians attacked him and killed some of the men there, and they had to send a rescue party up and take him back down to the Ogden area. But he ended up being one of the first settlers in Providence, and then they moved out to Beaver Dam. From Beaver Dam, they moved out to Connor Springs. And they had Myron Bushnell, and then Henry Dennison, and then they had James Madison, and then they had Emma and Marion were their kids. And Myron and Henry Dennison, after the battalion was disbanded, he went back and got his children, and he met a widow lady there, and he married her, Cynthia Bowen, and they came west, and Myron and Henry Dennison came with them. James Madison had married back in the east, and he and his wife was one of the ones that joined one of the break-off groups off of the church. And they settled in Monona, Iowa, and they were living the law of consecration, and all kinds of things happened. It was so bad that the government finally came in and broke the settlement up because the guy that was over it was taking so much advantage of the people there. And so I'm getting ahead of myself. So Myron and Henry Dennison came out. They were living in Ogden, and they went up. Anyway, Myron was actually involved in the massacre. He was one of the rescuers who came in to bury the dead, and so he's documentation of the Alamo massacre. And
we think that, go ahead.
Well, I personally believe that's why the Durfees ended up here, was because of that massacre, because they were living on Connor Spring down there, and that spring is kind of brackish. It's not real good water, and back then, you know, they were trying to raise food for their family and so forth, and I think they were struggling with that salty water and that salty ground. And he came out here on that rescue and saw these nice clean clear streams running out of the mountain and nobody here. And this was in 1862 about. And so once the Indian problems were kind of cleared up, why he loaded up his family and brought them out here. 1878 I think it was. So I think that's why the Durfees ended up here.
And so Myron came in 1878, Henry Dennison came up in 1879. Then in the early 1880s, James Madison, who was back in Iowa, when they broke him up, he brought several people from his community, from this break-off community, and they moved out here to Elmo. So we have all three brothers living here in Elmo. Do you remember Dave Durfee? Are you familiar with a Dave Durfee? Yeah, the Bruce, the one that Ella Bruce, that her husband, that she was killed. She married one of James Madison's sons. So there's still some, and Tryphena Butts, James Madison's wife, she's buried in the cemetery out here. But he went, a lot of the people after they came here, a lot of this break-off group, they stayed here for a little while and then they went up into Hagerman, and there is a church of reorganized church. And so they became part of that. And James Madison went up there, but she stayed in Elmo and wouldn't go up with him, and so she's buried here in the cemetery. So it all fits in together, but the three brothers, Myron and Henry Dennison, most of us are related from one or both. And you're not the only one here. So anyway, that's where the Durfees fit in.
Oh, I was going to tell you too, that Arlie is Karen Jones's dad, and Ray Jones, which was Bess, they married each other, so they're as close as anybody. And Candy, their daughter works with me, and I was teasing her about it. She was adopted, so she says, I'm glad, that's the only time I'm glad I was adopted. Okay, I'm going home.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks.